minor cleanup to the professional employer organizations bill that moved those to our agency last year.
Okay. Are there any questions? Is there any objections to this bill being introduced? Seeing none, it will be introduced. Thank you very much. Next, we'll have House Majority Leader Chris Croft. Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request the committee sponsor a bill draft RS 2010. It's a land acquisition by foreign adversaries bill.
And that's going to be introduced in the House or the Senate?
In the House.
In the House. Thank you. Any objection to that being introduced? Seeing none, it will be introduced.
Have a second.
Got the second one?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Request committee sponsor a bill draft for RS 2099. It's about drone acquisition.
Any objection to that one? Seeing none, will be introduced. Thank you very much. Yes, Senator Reichman.
Since I'm not sure who makes those, Mr. Senator.
Okay, it will be introduced.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Mike Taylor.
Airport and Industrial Park.
Any objections? Seeing none, it will be introduced. Thank you very much. Huh? It will be in the Senate, yes. Okay. The next item on the agenda would be a presentation from Kansas Legislative Post Audit and Katrine Osterhaus. Yes, there she is. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the committees. I am here to present the audit on the transparency database from the Department of Commerce. The question is listed on page 2. You should have the audit in your notebooks, I hope, and if not, it is available online as well. So the question is, does the Department of Commerce Economic Development Transparency Database meet the requirements of the state law? The short answer for this is the transparency database did not contain some of the statutorily required programs and was missing some program and recipient information at the time of our audit. So I'll start with some background information on page 3. The 2019 legislature passed a law requiring the creation of the Economic Development Incentive Program database for purposes of providing the public with information about economic development programs and recipients in Kansas. This is commonly referred to as the transparency database. The Department of Commerce is responsible for creating and maintaining this database, and to that end, it must gather information even if it comes from other state agencies. The department also has to regularly update the database with new information about the programs and recipients. So what are those requirements? The database must contain numerous economic development incentive programs, as well as specific program-level information and recipient-level information for those incentive programs. Economic development incentive programs are broadly defined in the statute, but there is no list in the statute itself. It does include things like economic development programs administered by Commerce, as well as tax credits administered by the Department of Revenue, and then some other programs that might be locally administered as well. The law also requires the database to have 3 functional features. It must be accessible from the website, from the department. It must be searchable to find specific information, and it must be printable by the user. So before we get into the findings, I'll go over what the database looked like at the time of our audit. And you can see a picture of that on page 5 in the audit itself. You will see a screenshot that shows what this database looked like. And there's actually 2 components to that. There is a program sidebar to the left of that screenshot. That portion contains a list of programs and links to see program information. The second component in that screenshot is kind of to the right there. It looks kind of like a spreadsheet type table, and it contains recipient information for particular programs. So on that same page, on page 5, towards the bottom, we get into the findings of the audit. The first thing we did is to check to see if all statutorily required incentive programs appeared in the database at all. So given that this was a limited scope audit, which literally means like 100 hours for us, we did not have much time to independently search and establish a list of what those economic programs should be. Instead, we relied on a list about 60 programs that our economic development audit team commonly uses and previously has used as well. And so that is the list that we used, those 60 programs. So we expected to see those 60 programs in the database, and that's what we looked for. When we checked, we found that 13 incentive programs were either missing from that sidebar that I mentioned, or from the table, or from both parts. You can see a further breakdown in the sub-bullets there on page 6, as well as Appendix A shows all of the 60 programs we were looking for in the results. Because the 13 programs we were missing in some capacity, that also means that those 13 programs were missing in other statutorily required information. Officials told us that in some cases that is because they were still waiting for information. In other cases, they mentioned that it is difficult to get that information in there. For example, star bonds, they stated it was difficult to standardize that information into that recipient level format. Next, I'll cover the results of our sample review on required program level information for programs that were included in the database. And again, it's a limited scope, so we picked 5 programs. Those were Child Daycare Assistance Tax Credit, Historic Preservation Tax Credit, Job Creation Fund, Private Activity Bonds, and Strategic Economic Expansion and Development, or SEED for short. The results of our work are not projectable because it was not a randomly chosen list. And we evaluated those 5 selected programs to see if they contained 11 statutorily required items. And those things included things like program goal, compliance rate, return on investment, evaluations, and those things. Overall, we found that those 5 programs were missing some statutorily required information. 5 pieces were missing from all programs, and that is compliance rate, return on investment, program evaluation, total incentive by program, and total incentive by county. In some cases, we considered the information to be non-compliant because it required several steps to get there, or it was difficult to find. So for example, total incentive by program could only be found if the user downloaded the database and used Excel to manually filter or query the information to get to that particular information. And again, you see some full details of the findings for this program level review in Appendix B, starting on page 20. We asked commerce officials about the missing information. On page 8, you can see their explanations, but generally they highlighted that technical hurdles and unique program requirements were the reasons for why that information was missing. They also said that some things like ROI did not necessarily pertain to some programs, so there was no information to be provided. We agree with some of that, but we do think that in some cases when the database doesn't have it, it should at least contain an explanation as to the reason for why it was not available. Next, we turn our sample review on required recipient level information. If you follow along in the report that's starting on page 8 there at the bottom. We selected a judgmental sample of 24 recipient level records from the same 5 programs I mentioned earlier. So between 4 and 5 records per program. Again, our work cannot be projected because it was not randomly selected. For the 24 recipient level records, we evaluated whether they included the 8 statutorily required pieces of information, such as name of recipient, address, county, amount of funds received. All 24 records included 6 of the 8 elements. However, information regarding benchmarks and benchmark progress was missing for most of the records that we looked at. We considered them missing because some of that provided labels in the database were too vague and confusing to provide useful information to the user. And more information on that is shown on page 9. Lastly, I'll cover our findings to the functionality piece of things. And here, all 3 functionality pieces were actually in compliance. So again, to remind you, it was accessible from the website. The database was definitely searchable, and it was also printable. So compliance in the area of functionality. I wanted to mention that this audit does represent a snapshot in time. We were only able to review the database at a particular point. We were not able to re-review and re-evaluate things. Even throughout the audit, as Department of Commerce staff told us that things were being fixed or changed or updated, so we did not go back each time. Again, it is a limited audit. So we do have 2 recommendations on page 11. One goes to the legislature. We recommended the legislature should consider amending the law to clarify what elements should be included in the database itself, and if elements would be acceptable to be available outside of that database, such as via links or other sources of information. The second recommendation is for Commerce to ensure that the database contains all statutorily required information. And to note, in this recommendation, the department did not agree with that one. And with that, I'll stand for questions.
Any questions? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did you happen, and I didn't ask this previously, but when you were looking at the database, did you actually ever pull up the downloads or download any of the lists, and were those complete?
Complete in what sense?
So, for example, if I wanted to pull up a program and I wanted to download all of the items, let's say the 826 items in a program, when you pulled it up, did it include all the information, or did you check on that?
I don't think we did that, no.
Okay, I just did here because that's something I forgot to do myself, and I noticed on here, I pulled up HPIP, and the amount offered, the amount claim is completely blank. Those columns are completely blank for all of the 800 and some. So therefore, you would have to go back to each and every individual recipient and add up or pull those numbers in another method. And also, my second question is, do you happen to know if there are totals anywhere or if that's required in statute? Because I can't recall if the total amount for every program, the total amount for every recipient was required in statute.
Yes, so on that one, we do know that the totals by program are required, and we said that that did not adequately fulfill the statute because you have to go through those extra steps. And if I could, just to make sure I complete my answer on the first question you had, we did download the database in its full sense, but what you were saying about individual programs, we did not do that because, again, it was a limited scope.
Okay, so just for our committee to know, it appears as if the website is so much better than where we've been. So definitely kudos to Department of Commerce for that. But it looks like we may still be missing data when we're pulling down the data, and we may also be missing those totals. And those are totals that we've been asking for in our committee and other committee. We still don't have those. Thank you.
Any other questions? Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Williams, for that. So I worked with Representative Williams on this bill the first time, and there were some things we didn't think of as far as like local governments reporting in, and there's not a lot of teeth to cause them to do that. The whole idea of the website is to kind of get a grasp on what we're actually giving to who we're giving it to. And so we do have another bill coming this year that will take some of the advice of the legislative post-audit and then make some other changes. And but yeah, the Department of Commerce has really done a good job of responding to our concerns over the last 2 years since they launched this, or 3 years since they launched this. And so I'll echo the kudos to them, but we are going to make some good changes to this. Thanks.
Any other comments? Seeing none. Thank you very much. Next, we'll have the Principal Auditor, Joshua Luty. I hope that's not. Joshua, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of both the House and Senate Commerce Committees. Like the chairman said, I'm Josh Luthai, a principal auditor with Legislative Post Audit. I'm here to talk to you today about 3 economic development incentives we evaluated in 2023. State law previously required us to evaluate all new incentive programs the year after they were created. So here are the 3 incentive programs I'm going to be talking to you about were created in 2022, and then we evaluated them in 2023. So the data I'm going to be talking about is a little bit dated at this point. Additionally, because these programs were very new at the time we did our evaluation, there wasn't a lot for us to evaluate in terms of things like return on investment. So what I'm primarily going to be doing today is talking to you about how these incentives work and then identifying one issue for you all to consider. I'm going to be working off of a memorandum that's from me. Its subject is state housing tax credits and SEED. I believe you all should have that available to you. The first one I'm going to start out with is the affordable housing tax credit. This information begins on page 1 of the memo. So, in 2022, the legislature established the Kansas Affordable Housing Tax Credit. This tax credit is administered by the Kansas Housing Resources Corporation, or KHRC. The KHRC also administers a federal tax credit called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. So we have the state Kansas Affordable Housing Tax Credit and the federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. I'm just going to call those the state and federal tax credits at this point to try and avoid getting tongue-tied. But when the KHRC allocates federal tax credits to a low-income housing development project, it is also supposed to allocate a matching amount of state housing tax credits. These tax credits are meant to help incent the development of low-income rental housing, and the idea here is developers get these tax credits, and then they give these tax credits to investors in exchange for investment. This helps them get better investment terms so they can offer more affordable housing to tenants. And this is where things get a little bit complicated as we kind of move into page 2 of the memo here. When the KHRC makes a tax credit allocation to the project, the folks involved in the project who get that credit can claim that credit every year for the next 10 years once the project is completed and occupied by tenants. So, to kind of put this in concrete terms, if the KHRC gives a project $1 million in credits, once that project is complete and there are people living in it, the investors who have that credit get to claim $1 million in tax credits every year for the next 10 years for a total of $10 million in foregone revenues. In the second year, KHRC will repeat this process for about 10 years up until there's kind of a cap on how many credits are out there being claimed on a year-to-year basis. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn and talk about the economic and fiscal impacts that we're aware of so far. So in 2023, KHRC awarded about $25 million in state tax credits to 24 housing projects. And like I said earlier, the investors involved in those projects are going to claim those $25 million in credits every year for the next 10 years once the projects are complete. I can't tell you whether they're complete at this time. I imagine they're probably getting close. But that means KHRC's first year of allocations should, over about the next 10 years, cost the state as much as $250 million in foregone revenues. And then I checked earlier before coming over here today, and it appears to me that in 2024, KHRC also allocated about another $25 million in state tax credits. Those tax credits will, again, be claimed every year for about the next 10 years for another $250 million in foregone revenues. So between the KHRC's first 2 years of tax credit allocations, the state is looking at potentially $500 million in foregone revenues if all those credits get claimed over the next roughly 11 years. That will continue year over year, and the amount of tax revenues foregone every year will increase. Based on some KDOR estimates, we think after about 10 years, the total amount of foregone revenue the state might experience on a year-to-year basis could be between about $140 million and $280 million. And that will bring me to the issue we're bringing to you all for further consideration. It is on the last page of the memo, page 5. State law doesn't cap the amount of state tax credits that KHRC can allocate. So the amount of credits it can allocate is only limited by the federal limit on the federal credit. And when we did our work, that limit was about $28 million. We noticed that other states that have state tax credits similar to this Kansas tax credit tend to cap their state tax credit. For example, Oklahoma caps its state tax credit at $4 million in awards per year. That means they're essentially limiting their potential tax liability or foregone tax revenues to about $40 million a year instead of, like I said earlier, the potential $280 million here in Kansas. So those are my comments on the affordable housing tax credit. Mr. Chair, do you want me to continue with the others, or do you want to take questions after each program?
Go ahead, and then we'll take questions afterwards.
Okay. The next program I have to talk about is the Housing Investor Tax Credit. That is on page 3 of the memo. This one is also administered by the Kansas Housing Resources Corporation. Under this one, KHRC is able to allocate tax credits to housing projects in counties with populations of less than 75,000. This is similar to the affordable housing tax credit I just talked about in the sense that it is meant to incent the creation of housing in the areas to which these awards are made. However, projects that receive this particular tax credit cannot receive the tax credit I just talked about a moment ago. Also, unlike the prior tax credit, this tax credit is capped to $13 million in awards each year, so KHRC cannot issue more than $13 million in these tax credits every year. It also doesn't have that kind of funny 10-year stream effect I talked about earlier. In terms of economic and fiscal impacts, in 2022 and 2023, KHRC allocated almost $20 million in credits to 41 housing projects. Those projects included both rental units and units that will be owner-occupied. I can't tell you what KHRC has done more recently, and this is a more straightforward tax credit, so that's really all I have to say on this one. And then finally, on page 4 of the memo, I have the Strategic Economic Expansion and Development Program. This is also called the SEED program. This is a program that Commerce created in 2022. It is not a statutory program. To fund this, Commerce uses funds from the Technology-Enabled Fiduciary Financial Institutions Development and Expansion Fund. That's another tongue twister for me. But under state law, Commerce is allowed to use that fund to do things like promote rural economic development. So Commerce went on and they created this SEED program. Through this program, Commerce makes grants of up to $50,000 to organizations in rural counties. This could be the counties themselves, it could be local economic development organizations, things of that nature. And those organizations are then supposed to use these grant funds to do community development. Those things could include, making improvements to childcare, improving a library, or something of that nature. This program is also dependent on funding from that very long-named fund I just mentioned a second ago, and that's related to this thing called TEFIs, which is an entirely different topic. But if that fund doesn't continue to get revenues from those TEFIs, then it would presumably cease to exist. And then finally, in terms of economic and fiscal impacts of the program, in 2023, Commerce awarded about $2.7 million to 61 grantees. Each of those grantees was in a different county, so that money went to 61 different counties. At the time we did our work in September 2023, Commerce had distributed about 2.2 million of the 2.7 million, and that's because it doesn't give the full amount of each award to the grantees until their projects are at least 50% complete. So when we did our work, not all those projects were fully complete. I can't speak to what has happened since then. So that is my overview of those 3 incentives. Would be happy to stand for questions.
Questions? Seeing none? Whoop, we have any? Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. I very much appreciate your work on this. There's quite a few things in here, and I just want to point out that these are tax credit programs that did not go through tax. And would you speak again a little bit to the guardrails that do not exist? And I don't think the committee, we need to clearly hear the numbers that you were talking about and how difficult this could be for the state going forward.
So on the Kansas Affordable Housing Tax Credit, this is the tax credit that also that's meant to be a match to the federal low-income housing tax credit. The federal government gives each state a limited allocation of these credits. In 2023, that limit was $28 million in credits. So when KHRC allocates those credits to a housing project, it also allocates a matching amount of state tax credits. So when we did our work in 2023, KHRC allocated $25 million in federal credits to projects, which means they also allocated $25 million in state tax credits. The people who receive those tax credits get to claim them every year for 10 years once their housing projects are completed. So one year in which KHRC allocates $25 million equates to $250 million in foregone revenues over the next 10 years. This has a stacking effect over 10 years because they get to claim it for 10 years, such that after KHRC has done this for 10 years in a row, the potential foregone revenues could be as high as about $250 million a year if all those credits are allocated and if they are claimed every year.
Thank you. If I may, Mr. Chairman, and where are we at currently on those tax credits that have been issued or given away?
I know in 2023 and 2024, KHRC issued $25 million in credits each year. I do not know whether they have been claimed yet because the people who have them cannot start claiming them until their projects are complete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could we get an update on that from the department or revenue? We need those updated numbers. Those will be critical going forward. And in your recommendations, you do recommend that the legislature at least put guardrails, if not stronger.
We are identifying as that this is an issue where you might consider adding a guardrail if these potential fiscal impacts are of concern to you all.
And I will say legislative post-audit is sometimes reluctant to give recommendations, so I take this one with strong consideration, that we do need to look at the financial impact of this program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I found this audit to be quite alarming when I first heard it. And then we reviewed it again in the Interim Housing Committee over the summer. And it was equally as disturbing. I guess it didn't sink in the first time. I didn't really realize what we were doing, but this is the proverbial rat through the snake. Once we give these credits out, they're there, and they're there for 10 years. Currently, on the very first year, we spent $250 million of Kansans tax dollars over the next 10 years, and $250 million of U.S. tax dollars, which are also Kansas tax dollars. $500 million is what we spent. We got 2,200 low-income apartment units, and that's $200-some thousand an apartment unit. Granted, they will be rented out at to low-income individuals. I just think we can do a lot more with $500 million and 2,200 units. Also, we did it again this year, and so now we're up to $1 billion that we're going to be spending because it's 2 years in a row, and that's going to continue to grow. And if you run the budget out just a few years, and then you add in continuing to do this every year, we will bankrupt the state. And I have a bill that I'm going to introduce. I don't know if I'm going to do it today or not. I don't have an RS number yet, but it will eliminate this program, and we need to figure out a better way to address the housing in the state of Kansas. Thanks.
I'm going to ask the question, if we do what you just said, are we obligated to the ones that have already been in the program?
That might be a question for the revisers. It's my understanding that the tax credits have already been issued, and once the development is complete and people start moving in, we're on the hook for the next 10 years. And so the sooner we stop this, the better. Otherwise, I mean, I don't think there's much we can do about the downstream part.
Any other questions? Yes, Senator Dietrich.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation. It was a little bit hard to hear you if you'd step closer to that mic. So I have a question about those tax credits, similar to what Chairman Tarwater asked. At what point does the clock start ticking on the 10 years? If they've already been issued the tax credit, but they haven't claimed it yet, does the clock start ticking for when it was issued or when it was claimed?
My understanding is this clock starts ticking once the housing projects are complete and occupied. That is, the apartment buildings, for example, have been built and there are people living in them and the development is in compliance with the relevant rules and regulations. However, so that's when the clock starts. It's a little more complicated also, and I'm sorry for this, but if an investor doesn't have enough tax liability to fully use the credits they get in a particular year, they can carry that credit forward for up to 11 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to confirm if these tax credits are transferable or refundable. Where do we stand on those?
They are not, as I understand it, refundable. I'm not clear on the extent to which they're transferable, but I can follow up on that for you.
That would be great. Thank you. And I appreciate the good representative chairman on putting a bill forward. We're going to ask for the same language in the Senate Tax Committee. So thank you.
Eric, did you have something?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, just to confirm, it's our understanding that none of the credits have been claimed to date because none of the housing developments are operational. So as was mentioned, they'll be able to be claimed once those are actually operational. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you. But claiming is different than issued, correct? Or, I mean, we're obligated for some of these already. Is that correct?
That would be my understanding. So when they are issued, that means they've been given to a developer to pass on to investors. When they are claimed, that means the investor has used those credits to offset tax liability. So my understanding would be there are tax credits available out there that investors should begin claiming in the coming years.
But just to be clear, this is already on the books for the state of Kansas, these credits, some of them.
That would be my understanding.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. If none, thank you very much. We appreciate that report. Next, we'll have Sam Dadds, the Senior Auditor. Sam, are you here? There he is. Welcome, Sam.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm actually Matt Etzel. Sam is out conducting field work today, so I'm stepping in for him. I'm a performance audit manager here at Legislative Post Audit. Thank you for having me. I'm going to be going over the results of a limited scope audit that we did. It was titled Evaluating the Adequacy of the Department of Commerce's Pre-Employment Screening. This audit had one question, and that was, did the Department of Commerce use an adequate pre-employment screening process for select staff who oversee financial matters? The short answer to this audit question is that the Department of Commerce's hiring policies and procedures were not adequate to mitigate the risks associated with hiring applicants with a criminal history. Before I get into the depths of our findings, just a little bit of background for this audit. Commerce's hiring practices recently came into question after they unknowingly hired a felon who oversaw the state's economic recovery during COVID. Concerns arose from that regarding why Commerce didn't know about the previous convictions, which ultimately led to interest in this audit, looking at the department's hiring and screening processes for their employees. We did identify some best practices related to criminal history checks. So, and those are on page 4 of the report, if you have that in front of you. Generally, we found that best practices recommend criminal history checks for certain high-risk jobs. Those can include positions that oversee vulnerable populations or sensitive information like financial or personnel records. Criminal history checks can include things like local and national law enforcement records in various registries and watch lists, law enforcement agencies like the Kansas Bureau of Investigation or various consumer reporting agencies can compile these records for employees using things like an applicant's name or their fingerprints. The KBI also has a publicly available web tool where anyone can search for public criminal history records for Kansas from within Kansas for a small fee. In the state, state law identifies specific jobs that allow agencies to perform a national criminal history check through the KBI. So our review showed there's about 50 state positions in Kansas that are eligible for federal background checks, and we do list those 50 positions in Appendix B of the report if you're interested in more detail. In 2018, Executive Order 1812 was implemented, which prohibits staff of executive agencies from asking about an applicant's criminal history during the application process. It also prohibits any criminal records from disqualifying an applicant from an interview specifically. But we note this executive order does not prohibit executive agencies from conducting a criminal history check as a condition of employment. So noting the difference between disqualification of an applicant for an interview versus conducting a criminal history check as a condition for employment. It does appear the state law generally allows employers to conduct criminal history checks with the written consent of the applicant. At the time of our audit, the Department of Administration told us it's their interpretation that there isn't general authority for agencies to conduct criminal history checks unless it is explicitly stated in state law. In Commerce's case, state law identifies only one job that requires a national criminal history check, and that is for the state's boxing commissioner. With some of that background in mind, I'll move on to our main findings, which begin on page 6 of the report. So to complete this audit, we reviewed personnel records for Commerce's 5 most recent hires that oversaw the state's financial matters. That did include Mr. Clayton, who I'd mentioned previously, but there were in total 3 program managers and 2 accountants that we looked at from 2020 to 2024. What we ended up finding was that Commerce's hiring policies and procedures do not include any type of criminal history check for any jobs other than that one that I had previously mentioned, the boxing commissioner. Commerce officials explained they use the same hiring process for all their unclassified jobs. So for example, there are job-specific questions, standardized questions that the department asks of all applicants during their interviews, but these questions, for one, don't include asking anything about a criminal history. Officials told us that once they decide to hire an applicant, they perform a reference check and a social media check. They also relied on online searches of the applicant's name. Officials said they rely on these checks as well as applicants being forthcoming to reveal potential criminal histories or other problems during the application process. On page 7 of the report, you'll find some information about why the Department of Commerce doesn't do state-level criminal history checks. Through our audit and in working with them, that's because they don't think that they have the authority to do so, to do state-level criminal history checks. Our review showed that that state law does appear to allow employers to conduct in-state criminal history checks with written consent of the applicant. But state agencies still cannot use the KBI for a national criminal history check unless it is specifically enabled in state statute. Commerce officials told us they were unaware of the criminal history check options that they could use. So that would include things like the consumer reporting agencies. These CRAs are companies that can provide employment screening services that include things like credit checks, license verification, and criminal history information from state and federal databases. At the bottom of page 7, we discussed that Commerce didn't adequately document their hiring procedures for 3 of the 5 staff that we reviewed. We saw Commerce had templates available for documenting interviews and their reference checks, but the reference check summaries were not available for 3 of the 5 employees we reviewed, and interview notes were missing for 1 of the 5 employees we reviewed. So as a result, we couldn't determine if Commerce is following their processes consistently. State retention policy does require agencies to retain hiring documentation for the length of the employee's tenure plus 3 years. So we did expect Commerce to maintain that documentation. Our audit did have 3 recommendations, 2 for the Department of Commerce and 1 for legislative consideration. Those are on page 8 of the report. Our first recommendation is for the legislature to consider clarifying when and how executive agencies can obtain criminal history information on prospective job applications from the KBI or from other sources, such as those consumer reporting agencies. Then the 2 recommendations for the Department of Commerce. The first is that the department should strengthen their process for checking the backgrounds of applicants applying for jobs that oversee financial matters. And our final recommendation is that the department should use their available templates to create interview notes, reference check summaries, and internet search summaries, and retain those documents in accordance with the state's retention policy. That concludes my presentation. I would be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you very much. I'll ask the first question, and that is, who can see the KBI background check? What level of
Clearance?
yeah, who is that gets to review that?
I do not know the answer to that question. Beyond that, I can say anybody can basically have a in-state criminal check through the KBI for $30. But beyond that, for state background checks that would only be within the state of Kansas, I don't know who would have authority to review those necessarily. I don't think we looked at that as part of this audit.
If KBI did a background check, can a senator see that background check?
I do not know the answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Okay. And I believe the answer is no. You cannot see that. Do you have a question? Yes. Okay. Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think senators are precluded. Representatives are allowed to view those records, however. Not really. No, my question goes to the documents that didn't exist. Was there any explanation given? Were those checks not done, and thus there's no documentation, or do we have another instance of documents being destroyed for no good reason?
All that we know, the Department of Commerce officials told us that they don't retain some hiring records past 3 years from the date of hire, despite the state's retention policy. So I'm not sure why those were specifically destroyed or no longer available, but it just appears that they did not retain them.
I see a habit. I see a common practice being developed here. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in your research on the agency, I have a question about how the agencies are structured. Do they have their own HR departments, or do they use Department of Administration?
To perform background checks?
Background checks, the hiring processes, their interviews, all the documentation that didn't get done is usually done by Human Resources Department, usually with a SHRM, SHRM certified human resources individual. So my question is, do the agencies, and I don't know the answer to this, do the agencies have their own HR departments, or do they just use Department of Administration?
So I could only speak to the Department of Commerce because that's the only agency that we reviewed for this, but they would be doing their own interviews and screening processes internally, but they're not currently conducting criminal background checks. So
may I just clarify my question a little bit further? So I think my question is, when you have a human resources department, you have protocols that have to be followed, and you have checks and balances. So does that department live within that agency, or do they use Department of Administration as the umbrella over all the agencies for that?
yeah, I see your question. It's a good question. I do not know. I will check with Sam. I'm sure he will have more detail, and I could get back to you on that.
Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you.
I think Mr. Chair, I think from my perspective, not knowing the answer to that, I think one of the easy fixes is just making sure that every, agency, whomever they use to do these hiring practices follows national standards, right? Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you very much for your report.
Thank you.
Okay. We're going to go back to bill introductions and Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have one more. That the bill introduction that I referenced earlier is RS number 2025 RS 0608, and that is the bill that eliminates the low-income housing tax credit program. Any objection from House members on that? It'll be introduced in the House. Seeing none, we'll issue that bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, so as an announcement, the House will be meeting tomorrow at 1:30 in this chamber, and the Senate will not be part of that meeting. Tomorrow. So if there's nothing else, thank you very much, and we are dismissed.